the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Thursday, February 12th, 2015. The latest in the U.S. war on ISIS. As captives are murdered and more bombs are dropped, we'll analyze where it could all lead with my guest, Professor Stephen Zunes. An acclaimed Marxist economist, Richard Wolff, joins us in studio to discuss the optimistic-sounding jobs report, the progress on the minimum wage, Greece's electoral revolution, and more. That's coming up today after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced that there was a, quote, glimmer of hope in tense negotiations that took place overnight in Minsk, Belarus, over the ongoing Ukraine conflict, with Germany and France taking the lead and with the U.S. notably absent. Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko met face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin. They spent the night tussling over a conflict that has threatened to destabilize the entire region and launch a new Cold War. The result so far is an announced ceasefire starting on February 15th and a longer-term plan for disarmament. It is not clear if the agreement will hold. The U.S.'s recent announcement to begin heavily arming Ukraine's military appeared to be unpopular among Europe's leadership. Meanwhile, the IMF has just announced a 4-year plan fueling billions of dollars of loans to Ukraine to prop up its badly weakened economy. Well, Chenjerai, it appears as though everyone wants this conflict to end, including Russia, except for the U.S. What do you think?
Well, I think we have to really consider how the U.S. is supporting its own interests. It really is problematic. You know, this agreement for a ceasefire is a good thing. But if we go historically and look at what the U.S.'s role has been in the Ukraine, and this also extends to NATO's role and the way that NATO expanded into the Ukraine in violation of agreements that they had made, that were made to Gorbachev in the past, we can see that the U.S. has had a role in a way in escalating this whole conflict. So hopefully they can really urge for diplomatic means to resolve this conflict and avoid some type of tragedy. This is what I think is called for here.
And it appears as though the U.S. just simply staying out of negotiations is leading to better outcomes. We'll be following the Ukraine crisis and the outcomes of this negotiating gathering in Minsk, Belarus, in the next few days. Then the group Reporters Without Borders has just released its annual World Press Freedom Index. Today, what it found is a, quote, worldwide deterioration in press freedom over the past year. The report identified Syria, Russia, Israel, and Hong Kong as being among the worst perpetrators alongside non-state actors like ISIS and Boko Haram. The United States fell several points on the index compared to the previous year, primarily because of how journalists were treated during the unrest over police violence in Ferguson, Missouri last year. The U.S. is now number 49 out of 180 countries. Finland retained its top spot for the 5th year in a row for having the freest press. Meanwhile, in Egypt, which ranks very low on the list at 158 out of 180, 2 imprisoned Al Jazeera journalists have finally been released on bail. Bahar Mohammed and Mohammed Fahmy were convicted of helping the Muslim Brotherhood by spreading, quote, false news. The journalists and their employer maintained they were simply doing their job. Well, Chenjerai, what does this index of press freedom say about the state of journalism in the world today? It doesn't look very good.
It doesn't look very good, but one thing I think that it points to is the crucial role that journalism plays for trying to maintain democracy and human rights. And we actually see how determined governments are, both on the local and national level, to repress journalists. What we can see is the valuable role that journalists play. The other thing I think that we should pay attention to is the fact that the U.S., it's sad that the U.S. has fallen this far, but I see that actually as a positive thing in the sense that we at least are looking realistically at what's going on in the U.S., and we no longer are functioning in this illusion that the U.S. is this shining city on a hill that doesn't have these problems. We now know that we do, and we have to continue to fight for a free press.
And finally, here in the United States, FBI Director James B. Comey is expected to give a major address today in Georgetown University on the topic of police violence aimed at African Americans. It is apparently the first time an FBI head will publicly tackle an issue concerning race relations in depth. Those who have seen the text of Comey's speech infer that it may address issues of implicit racial bias among police officers, but ultimately claim that law enforcement is sincere in its desire to play a constructive role in society. As if underscoring the importance of addressing the issue, yet another video has come to light of a fatal police shooting, this time of an unarmed Latino man in the state of Washington. 35-year-old Antonio Zambrano Montes was shot by police officers in Pasco as he ran away from them with his hands up in the air. The man's body was handcuffed after he was apparently dead. He had been caught throwing rocks at parked cars and then threw some at the police when confronted. It is possible he was struggling with mental illness. Chenjerai, are you heartened that James Comey is at least acknowledging police violence so publicly?
I am. I think it's a beginning. It's a good start. But this conversation is going to have to go very far, and I hope that people are ready for the conversation to go as far as it needs to go. These incidents keep happening. That video with Antonio Zambrano Montes was just horrible. If you see what happened, it seems almost crystal clear, kind of like the Eric Garner video. But I think that the conversation is going to have to get past even the idea of police reform. It's going to have to get into deeply held white supremacist views in this country. It's going to have to get into this problem of the resorting to lethal force and understandings about that. It's going to have to get into what we consider reasonable force and what's under our jurisdiction to examine. And so there's really going to have to be some deep conversations that are going to touch a lot of different cultural institutions. And I hope we're ready for those.
And it's unlikely that James Comey will get that in-depth. Chenjerai, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. President Obama made a formal request to Congress yesterday to authorize a 3-year military operation against Islamic State militants, citing the brutal actions of ISIS against populations in Iraq, Syria, and in Kurdish regions, and the various U.S. citizens who were captured and killed. Obama asked for a broad mandate to, quote, use the armed forces of the United States as the president determines to be necessary and appropriate. The proposed authorization did specify that it does not authorize, quote, enduring offensive ground operations. Just a day earlier, U.S. officials had reviewed photographic evidence and concluded that 26-year-old Kayla Mueller, held hostage by ISIS, had been killed. Mueller became the 4th U.S. citizen to be murdered by ISIS. She was captured while serving as an aid worker in Syria after volunteering in the West Bank with a Palestine-based international solidarity movement and with African migrants in Tel Aviv. My guest is Stephen Zunes. He's a professor of politics and international relations at the University of San Francisco, where he directs the program in Middle Eastern Studies. Welcome to Uprising, Stephen.
Good to be with you again.
Well, first on the issue of authorization for use of military force against ISIS, how do you explain what President Obama's goal is? Initially, he had cited Bush's use of executive power in the Iraq War. Now he's asking for permission months after he started this war.
Well, the original rationalization that he did not need a new authorization because of the Iraq War authorization back in 2002 and the post 9/11 authorization in 2001 was ridiculous. I mean, very few people took that seriously. And I think basically he came around to recognizing that given that this new war is going to take a while, it would be better to make it official and to get rid of any ambiguity. And given that it might not necessarily go so well, have somebody, namely Congress, to share the blame if it doesn't.
Now, the request for authorizing war is pretty open-ended. However, it does specify, quote, no enduring offensive ground operations. But it seems pretty broad in that the president determines anything that the president determines to be necessary and appropriate is, what it authorizes. And is that pretty typical of war authorizations to be so broad?
Well, the president is commander-in-chief, and given that the goals of this and the enemy that the United States is fighting is really unlike any before, they did make it a little clearer than they might otherwise do. Instead, in terms of giving that kind of executive power, it's quite troubling actually, because there's absolutely no geographic limit of where this war can be fought. It is good, of course, that he did, I think both because it's his own desire to keep the footprints on the ground pretty minimal, and also because he figured he needed that to get enough Democratic and libertarian-leaning Republican votes to get it passed. But it does leave open the use of special forces for hit-and-run operations, certainly search and rescue in case a pilot gets shot down. But ironically, some of the biggest disagreements coming out of Capitol Hill are from Republicans who say they should not have that clause at all, that the United States should essentially be able to make unlimited war. So it's kind of ironic that our great system of checks and balances is between a choice of war and more war.
Let's turn to Kayla Mueller, the latest victim, at least American victim as far as we know, of the ISIS group. She was an interesting character. Some have even compared her to Rachel Corrie, the young aid worker who volunteered with the International Solidarity Movement and was killed a number of years ago by an Israeli bulldozer. Is that an apt comparison from what you've seen of her and seen of her writings and know of her?
Well, certainly she was this young idealist who had worked in a number of difficult situations, in addition to the African migrants in Tel Aviv and working with ISM in the West Bank. She'd also worked with Tibetan refugees in India. What really strikes me, though, is the reaction to her death while a captive by ISIS. The media coverage has been very sympathetic. Some strong words of condolences from President Obama, from Senator McCain, and I keep wondering if she had been killed like Rachel Corrie by Israeli occupation forces instead of at the hands of the ISIS terrorists, how different the reaction would be. I mean, Rachel's death, Rachel was vilified in much of the media, and out of Washington, there was very little reaction. Certainly no condolences or any support. So I guess it depends on you may be very similar in terms of your idealism and your work for peace and justice, but if you're it depends on who you're killed by. Will depend on the reaction you get back here in the United States.
Some very extreme right-wing conservative blogs did denigrate her with terrible language despite her being killed. ISIS claimed that Jordanian airstrikes against their positions actually killed her. U.S. officials say that's not true. And there's some lots of sort of contradictory reports over what happened to her. There was also apparently a U.S.-led attempt to rescue her, which failed. It was reported she was given to an ISIS fighter as a bride, which, if true, is extremely troubling to hear. In a letter that she wrote to her family last year that she managed to get out, via other captives who were released, she says that she was, quote, treated with the utmost respect and kindness. How much do we know of what actually happened to her?
We really don't. It's probably going to be some time before we do. ISIS is a pretty despicable cult by almost any measure. At the same time, they may before they killed her, if indeed they did kill her, they may have been treating her reasonably well. but it's really hard to say. I mean, this is a very different situation. It's not like other conflicts where you can get journalists and others to come in and interview. You can't bring in the Red Cross to check on the condition of POWs. We're really dealing with an incredibly desperate entity that really knows no bounds in terms of its behavior. So who knows what happened? And similarly, I wouldn't put it past the possibility that she was indeed killed by Jordanian airstrikes. There have been civilian casualties in the Allied air attacks against ISIS positions, which of course they have used to their advantage in their propaganda.
Let's talk about what the reaction in the Arab world has been. The Jordanian airstrikes this week that also happened alongside resumed airstrikes by the United Arab Emirates is being seen as a reflection of increased popular anger in the Arab world after the Jordanian pilot Muaz al-Qasasbeh was brutally burned alive, and the video of that killing posted online. How have the conversations, as far as you know, in the Arab world changed since that particular incident of that killing?
Well, it was particularly gruesome and indeed very anti-Islamic. Muslims don't even believe in cremation when someone's already dead, much less burning people alive. And it just shows just how extreme, how marginal they are in terms of how most Muslims see the world. And of course, like our soldiers, like our POWs, governments will, try to milk public sympathy to support more militaristic policies. I mean, I think people are genuinely united in their mourning and disgust for what happened. But they're not necessarily united in terms of policy. There are great divisions there, as here, about whether this kind of military action is the right way to combat the threat.
What about in Japan? I mean, there were two Japanese citizens, one of them a journalist, who were killed at around the same time as the Jordanian pilot was killed. Japan was asked for a $200 million ransom, which they refused to give. Has the Japanese government taken a different position than other countries on this war?
Well, they're restrained, of course, by their post-World War II constitution, which severely limits Japan's ability to engage in any kind of military operations, beyond protecting the shores of Japan. So there's not a lot of what they could do in terms of military operations, but it did underscore, I think, for a lot of people that ISIS does not just go after countries that may be attacking attacking them directly, and not just certain religious minorities or whatever. They'll go after anybody.
And then back to the issue of the public outrage in the Arab world, there's been apparently a new viral campaign that was launched in Lebanon over the weekend where ordinary people are videotaping themselves burning the ISIS flag on video and posting it online to YouTube. They're likening it to the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. It's, of course, interesting because the flag has a phrase considered very sacred in Islam. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. What do you make of this sort of interesting propaganda backlash?
Well, certainly, I think there is a strong motivation throughout the Arab and Islamic world for people to distance themselves from ISIS. There is genuine outrage. Of course, when you do burn a flag that has inscriptions from the Holy Quran on it, it raises some questions. I know some folks who are burning Israeli flags at a demonstration against the occupation. They made a point of cutting out the Star of David before they lit the flag on fire because they wanted to make clear they were not attacking Judaism. So the fact that they indeed went ahead with the flag with the Quranic verse on it, unfortunately, I think might alienate a lot of people when they are looking for greater unity in this cause. But I do also think it just underscores the incredible outrage throughout the region. Not only do you have this fanatical group covering an area and a population larger than many Arab countries, but one that is doing this horror in the name of Islam.
Here in the United States, the hacktivist group Anonymous has also joined the fight against ISIS, taking it upon themselves to shut down social media sites, hundreds of Twitter accounts held either by ISIS members or supporters of ISIS. And it's interesting to see Anonymous and the United States government, that are normally at loggerheads, turn into these strange bedfellows. And I'm wondering what you make of this approach by Anonymous to target ISIS propaganda efforts rather than drop bombs. Could it be possibly a more effective strategy?
I think so. I mean, just to add to strange bedfellows, you have Iran, you have Syria, you have all sorts of folks that are uniting in this. But I think this I don't. It's hard to say how influential their online campaigns are. They're pretty sophisticated in terms of presentation, and it has been useful in gaining recruits. And so many people see this as indeed a good tactic. But generally, when you're dealing with terrorists, when you're dealing with extremists, you want to you cut their lines of support. Whether not just in terms of arms, but in terms of propaganda, in terms of recruits, in terms of financial transactions, and hacktivists, can do a lot of that, do a lot of that kind of thing. Indeed, the military side ends up more often than not creating a backlash where ISIS can try to portray itself as, we're defending the Islamic world against the foreign infidels, but if it makes it hard to get their message out, given their isolation, that seems to be a much more effective route in my view.
And so then let's finally, wrapping up the discussion on this ISIS war, particularly a day after President Obama has asked for this formal authorization for 3 years, what sort of effectiveness can a military operation have, given that the past years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been exactly the perfect examples of what can go, of everything that can go wrong, and all of the backlash that you can create, and all of the ways in which a war can make things much worse, and in fact how these wars have fueled the insanity of ISIS.
Exactly. I mean, given how horrible ISIS is, there are a lot of people who've opposed other U.S. interventions in the Middle East, and myself included, who have thought, maybe some limited target actions, maybe one of those few cases, where some kind of military action could be justified. But at the same time, you think, we've been bombing Iraq on and off for nearly a quarter century, and things have only gotten worse. There would be no ISIS if it weren't for this kind of intervention. Every intervention that we have had, including that of our allies like Israel, whose military interventions in wars we've supported to the hilt, they've always increased the extremist threat. And the only way that ISIS has had any defeats really were in places like Kobani, where you had the population, the subjected population, rise up with their allies and be able to fight them on the ground as fellow Muslims. This is how Al Qaeda in Iraq was defeated. It was not the surge. It was when the tribal leaders got together and said, these guys are so crazy and so fanatical. They're even worse than the Americans and the Baghdad government. We will ally with the Americans and Baghdad government to get rid of this threat in our midst. And that's how they were initially defeated. So if ISIS will be defeated, it's going to have to be done on the ground by the subjugated peoples themselves. And and I think the more the United States intervenes and tries to make it our fight, the less likely we will get that kind of support, because ISIS is turning off everybody, including Sunni Muslims, because of their fanaticism, their misrule. I mean, they're running these big cities and they can't get the water and electricity to work. And they're losing their support. And the last thing we want to do is that to give them the kind of political boost that would inevitably come the more the United States and these various Arab dictatorships end up taking the lead in the fight.
Finally, Stephen Zunes, I want to turn to another issue very briefly. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is due to visit in just a few weeks the United States. He's coming at the invitation of Congress, the Republican-dominated Congress, rather than traditionally the president. And it's turned into a very serious political spat because Republicans have gone over Obama's Obama's head. Not only is the White House mad, many Democratic members of Congress are mad. The Black Caucus has refused to attend the speech, as has Bernie Sanders. What sort of fallout could there be in the region, notwithstanding whatever Netanyahu thinks he can gain in his own election, but what sort of broader fallout can there be from this bizarre piece of political theater that's playing out here?
I think what's interesting is that we're actually seeing divisions regarding U.S. policy towards Israel, where we've often, had even the most outstanding liberal Democrats like Barbara Boxer taking positions comparable to the most right-wing Republicans, supporting these right-wing governments and against the more progressive, moderate elements within Israel. Not to mention, of course, the Palestinian Lebanese victims of these kinds of policies. And when Netanyahu last spoke a couple years ago, he got more standing ovations in his speech than Obama did in the State of the Union. And the Democrats were on their feet as quickly as the Republicans were. And so the very fact that we're actually, even though this is more about Iran, not about the Palestinians, the very fact that you are having so many prominent Democrats saying, this shouldn't be happening, and more saying we're not going to even be there when it does happen, I think is actually an opening that those of us who would like to see a more balanced U.S. posture when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. I think this could actually end up being something positive.
Stephen Zunes, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Stephen Zunes is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of San Francisco, where he directs the program in Middle Eastern Studies. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. The January jobs report has revealed that, at least according to conventional yardsticks, the U.S. economy seems to be picking up in pace, leading some to view it as a, quote, jobs machine. More than 700,000 new jobs were added last month, and the ongoing trend of fewer long-term unemployed Americans continued. Jobs were added in a variety of sectors, including retail, healthcare, construction, and manufacturing. Some economists called it the best jobs report since the recession hit. On the international front, financial and political leaders are gathering for the G20 meeting in Istanbul, Turkey. On the agenda is Greece's new government's demand for a renegotiation of its debt obligations. It remains to be seen if the newly elected Syriza party can foment a real revolution in economic policies in Europe. Meanwhile, oil prices all over the world have remained at record lows, mostly as a result of a glut in energy reserves. The ripple effect has been mixed, with energy sector jobs hemorrhaging, while other consumers seeing a form of economic stimulus from the savings from cheap gas. But economies deeply dependent on oil, such as Russia, are suffering severely. Joining us to make sense of the big economic picture is the acclaimed Dr. Richard Wolff. He's a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York City. He also teaches at the Brecht Forum in Manhattan and is the host of Economic Update. Welcome to Uprising, Dr. Wolff.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. So what do you make of this new jobs report that is leading people to declare the U.S. economy turning into a jobs machine? What sort of jobs are we talking about, first of all?
Well, most of the jobs that were lost in the Great Recession of the last 7 years were jobs that were reasonably well paid, had a reasonable amount of security, benefits that went with them. And what's very stark about the change in this country is that the jobs that people are getting now, that you're reporting about, are overwhelmingly jobs with fewer benefits, less security, and often much lower pay. So you're not going to get the kind of stimulus that normally would be associated with lower unemployment, because we're not giving back to people who lost good jobs anything like what they had. And the net result is they're paid less, which means they can spend less, their lives become more pinched, and we see a continuation, with the ups and downs of employment, of an economy in a long-term decline in terms of the real standards of living of the people in the country.
So you think that this particular jobs report is not necessarily indicative of a long term?
Absolutely. There is no way after the few months that we've had these good results to be all that excited about it. Give you an example. More people have left the labor market, have dropped out of even looking for a job than have been added in these recent months. One of the reasons the unemployment rate is down is the peculiar way this government counts unemployment. If you stop looking for a job, they consider you no longer unemployed, even if when talking to you, one would hear you're desperate for a job, you've gone back to being a housewife or a student or doing something not so legal in order to make a living. This is not good news. It looks like a reduction of unemployment, but the actual condition of our economy and of the people involved has deteriorated, not improved.
Now, some are making much of the fact that average hourly earnings have actually shown to have increased by a whopping 12 cents. But could that be at least hopeful? I mean, we're looking at essentially corporate America and industries deciding to rehire people they might have laid off at lower wages, and now maybe starting to feel like they can comfortably start to increase wages?
It's much too early to say. The long-term trend, and I'm talking 30 years, is for the real wages of America. The amount of money that people earn, adjusted for the prices they have to pay, is flat or declining. 2 or 3 months in which you get these tiny increases may make for good headlines because it can be put in a positive frame. But the basic condition of the American working people has gone absolutely nowhere. And at the same time, they become more productive. They produce more with better machines, more machines, computers. So workers are producing more and more for their employer, but the employer is giving them the flat same amount.
Right.
That's why we have an explosion of profits at the top, because we've set it up in such a way that all the improved productivity of our labor force accrues to the employer, none to the worker.
And yet people are also working harder than ever in terms of the hours that they're putting in.
The pace of their work, that's right.
And corporations are being sued for all of the unpaid overtime wages that they aren't giving those workers.
By the way, one more dimension that people should keep in mind. You know, when people become unemployed, they are entitled for a while to unemployment insurance, but after a while, the government shut that off. Number two, when they haven't got that help, they start leaning on their savings, which they've used up. We can see that. Number three, they start begging and borrowing from their relatives and their families and their friends. When they have run out of that, there is nothing left other than welfare or worse conditions. Then they go back to work, willing to accept a much poorer job, much lower wage, because they've run out of any option. That's what we're seeing, people desperate. This is not a sign of an economic health. This is a sign of trouble and severe suffering that is expressed in a falling unemployment rate, which the press, the mainstream press, tries to position as great news, but it really isn't.
What about the role of cheap oil? That has been a market change, at least in the last few months. People are spending less on gas. Is it possible that they're spending some of that tiny bit of surplus cash on other consumer goods, leading to a ripple effect throughout the economy?
That's what people hoped, and when the price of the oil and the gas went down, that was the prediction. But what we've seen when we look at the statistics is that most people are in such difficulty, economically speaking, are worried so much about the debts that have accumulated, that they're actually using what they save from gas to begin to pay down some of their debts, which is why Walmart and many other large retailers have had to report disappointing results, because the expected boom that they would get the money you used to spend on gas hasn't materialized.
And of course, all of these discussions in the mainstream are very much accept the fact that our economy is so deeply based on consumer spending. When gas prices rise, any little gains that might have been made would, of course, be lost. Is this consumer spending basis of our economy really the biggest Achilles heel?
It is in an economy in which you are squeezing the consumer. I mean, if you look at the flat wages, what it means when you put it together with the shrinking number of people in the labor force, there are fewer people working and getting jobs, and fewer people earning anything. The end result is you squeeze the consumer's capacity. If the consumer is indebted, you squeeze it even further. To have an economy depending on consumers, when you're squeezing them at their job and squeezing them at their income and squeezing them in their debts, is a recipe for the economic self-destruction that we're actually living through.
Let's talk about ways in which, through regulation, government can actually put money into people's pockets in a very direct way, and that is, of course, raising the minimum wage. At the federal level, President Obama has championed this, although it's extremely modest, and it seems as though local constituencies, places like Seattle and SeaTac, have taken it upon themselves quite successfully to push to $15 an hour. When SeaTac passed this ordinance to have a $15 an hour wage, businesses said the sky was falling. It was going to result in the shutting down of everything, but apparently that didn't happen.
You know, that's an old historical game. When people were outraged that children were employed, say here in the United States last century, and efforts were made to say you shouldn't hire children below 10 or shouldn't hire children below 12. The businesses said the sky would fall, they would go out of business, the community would collapse, and then we made a law, you can't hire children, and guess what? It didn't collapse. When laws went into effect that you can't pollute the environment, you can't dump your waste into the water or into the air, they said it would be, this is a mantra. For us to be slowed down by the demand for a minimum wage makes no more sense than to have never passed bills about child labor, sexual harassment on the job, environmental destruction. This is the resistance you get from business whose first name is profit maximization. They don't want anything to interfere, and the welfare of the community as a whole has to be fought for to go against that kind of gut reaction. But the problem is not that they will fall apart. The problem is they'll be a little less profitable than they were before, and that's not the same thing.
Right. So apparently SeaTac's experience has shown that businesses have in fact expanded, that hiring has increased, and one writer actually said that it proves that trickle-down economics is wrong.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, did those results surprise you? They surprised
Not at all,
okay.
because if you think about it, it's always been two sides of a process. If you raise the minimum wage, it's true, the employer now has to give the workers more, and that the employer doesn't like that. But in terms of the economic effect, remember that the workers now have more money in their pocket, which means they can spend more money than they could before, which creates the demand for goods and services, giving people jobs, making those goods and services. So you have to weigh all the effects. What business wants us to do is just look at the difficulty for a business when you have to pay a higher wage, and not look at the fact that those same businesses will have more customers with more money in their pocket if everybody gets a higher wage because of raising the minimum wage.
So that leads us to wonder, what would the effect be on the entire country if tomorrow Congress passed a federal minimum wage law decreeing everybody makes at least $15 an hour?
Well, you know, here's the irony. The minimum wage laws at the federal level went into effect in the middle of the Great Depression. It was Franklin Roosevelt, at a time when we had unemployment 3 times or 4 times what we have now, who said, it's more important for the welfare of this country, even in a depression, to raise the minimum wage. And that helped people get through a very hard time. It didn't make the depression worse, it made life for people much better. So it is a strange argument not to use the lesson of our own past to say, look, now do the same thing. And a footnote, to raise the minimum wage to $15 means, in real terms of what you can afford, basically just to get back to where we were when Roosevelt did it in terms of the purchasing power. Right. So there is nothing radical or strange about doing that. It's our history who teaches it. It's only the business community with a short-sighted notion of its immediate profits that is holding that back.
And wasn't it Nixon who had proposed a minimum income for Americans?
He toyed with that idea. You know, European countries, some of whom have great difficulties, others of whom are in better shape than the United States, almost all of them have a markedly higher minimum wage. The Germans, the French, the Italian, the minimum wage is higher. And that's not because it's this or that economic argument. It's that the power of the mass of people expressed in their trade unions, their socialist parties, their communist parties, that power simply doesn't permit them to get away with what they do in this country in terms of low wages. Right. It is not a sign of economic malpractice or ineffectiveness. It's actually a sign just of the power of working people on the one hand and business on the other, and the rest is really PR and is not really about the situation.
So let's talk about Greece, which is occupying Europe these days and making major headlines around the world. How heartened are you by Greece? I mean, the situation there, as far as I understand, for ordinary people was actually quite worse than even here in the United States over
Absolutely.
the last 5 years. People were comparing it to the U.S.'s Great Depression, and then a radical leftist party won elections, could possibly rewrite the rules of finance in Europe. Is that too optimistic, or do you think they're going to be constrained by this very rigid system?
It's going to be a very hard period of time ahead. I am enormously heartened. Let me tell you why. The situation in Greece is terrible. It is terrible in a way that Americans ought to pay attention to, because what has happened there could happen here, and there are many of the same forces pushing in that direction. The unemployment rate in Greece is 26 or 27%. That's higher than it was at the worst moment of the American Great Depression in 1933. Oh. Public employees have lost about 40% of their salaries in money terms between May of 2010 and the present. Pensions have been cut. The minimum wage has been reduced. They're selling off the assets of the country. It is a disaster for the people of Greece. And that's because the government has decided to bail out the big banks and to raise the money to take care of the big corporations. And it wants the mass of people to pay by cutting public employment and cutting public services, using the money instead to pay off the banks and to pay off their debts. The new government is the statement of the people who voted this government in with a mandate. We don't accept it. It is unfair and unconscionable that a capitalist crisis that we had nothing to do with bringing should lead to a bailout of the very banks that brought us to crisis, and now we're told to suffer, to do without, so that we can pay off all the creditors who made it possible to bail out the banks. This is outrageous. We won't have it. Up until now, people have grumbled, but they haven't gotten together, formed a political party, pushed hard, and won an election. It's a very important warning warning note in a way to everybody else in Europe and here too. What things can change in a very few years from the conventional old politics to a radical new. Will they be able to do it? That's what we're watching every day. But the effort is heroic. The commitment of the Greek people to get rid of the old parties that they used to support, to give a new leftist party a chance to do something different. No wonder the old powers of Europe are trying to hold them back and fighting. They're afraid for themselves where this model, this example might go and how it'll affect their own people.
And we're also paying attention to what's happening with the Podemos party in Spain. Italy has a party as well that looks very promising and inspired in part by Syriza. But the big difference between Greece and the U.S. in terms of us electing politically progressive leaders is, of course, that, first of all, Greece's entire political system is quite different. The party runs, and then the one that wins a majority gets to pick a leader. Ours has this bizarre electoral college system, and then we've got separate congressional elections. But the biggest difference is the tidal wave of billionaire dollars that overwhelms our system, I think, much more than Greece's system. Isn't our electoral system pretty much bought and paid for by the wealthy, much more so than Greece's?
I'm not sure it's much more. I think this is unfortunately common all across Europe. The laws do vary, but what seems to be constant is, and it isn't that surprising if you think about it, if the division between rich and poor is becoming more extreme in this country and Europe, and that's true, and a tiny number of people are amassing wealth, those people aren't stupid. They understand that if they're going to have more and more of the wealth in their own hands, sooner or later the mass of people are going to say, this is outrageous, and the mass of people are going to use the vote, where they're the majority, to undo the inequality. And the only way those at the top can prevent that from happening is if they buy the political system. How they buy it varies from country to country. But as long as we allow that kind of inequality, we really can't be surprised that the next step is always political corruption, because that's the only way those folks at the top can secure their situation as owning such an enormous portion of the
But the U.S. is the biggest economy in the world. The stakes are so much greater if the U.S. were to be swept by some new party. I mean, I can't even imagine that, but of course anything's possible. There's much, much more at stake, and the U.S. essentially writes the rules of global finance.
But you know, the Greek elite, and it's very similar to the American elite, and there's even an intersection between the two, they never dreamed that Syriza victory would be possible either. Yeah. As few as 4 or 5 years ago, Syriza was picking up 3-4% of the vote in Greek elections. It is a sea change. That's why it's so exciting. In a very short amount of time, this austerity program of putting the burden of this crisis onto the mass of people has boomeranged and come back to haunt the very people who imposed that austerity policy, and letting them know, you know, not only did you provoke the people to rethink their political loyalties, not only did you create the opportunity for a leftist party to go from 3% to a mandate winning of an election, but you may have set in motion the questions of people about the whole system that allows a few to become wealthy. You may be very sorry that you took that road, because the kickback, the pushback, may cost you a great deal more than it might have cost you if you'd been less austerity-driven in the first place.
You can only push people so far.
Exactly. And that will be true in this country and in the rest of Europe, just like in Greece. May happen first in Greece, but you pushed the Greek people harder, so it's not so surprising. It may take longer. Greeks have a long history of political activism that the United States has not had since the Second World War, so it'll take longer time. But just as people thought we would never have people in the streets, we had Occupy Wall Street, well, my advice is we haven't seen the political kickback in this country yet, but it is coming.
So what about very small local races like that of Kshama Sawant in Seattle, who got elected to the city council on an overtly socialist platform? To a lesser extent, we've seen things like the election of Senator Elizabeth Warren, less radical certainly, in Massachusetts. And I'm wondering if you think people on the left should try to sort of trickle up the political ladder if they want to change our economic system.
I think so. I think that the way I would put it, and I think the elections in Seattle and in Massachusetts and in quite a few other states at local levels is already a straw in the wind, a sign of where things are going. You know, in Europe it splits to the right and the left. The middle collapses. And between the Tea Party and Occupy and these elections of explicit socialists, we're seeing it slower and more diffuse, but we're seeing it in this country too. I think the bottom line is this. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, the American working class organized itself into the CIO, Socialist Party, and Communist Party. And together, they were able to put pressure on the president to create Social Security, to create a minimum wage, to hire people to give them an unemployment compensation, and to hire them for government jobs. We don't have that today because after the war, the business community saw what the power of an organized people from below could do, and they crushed it. They demonized the communists, they expelled the socialists, and they have been working for 50 years to crush the labor movement. And that has been quite successful. We don't have the kinds of organizations in place that the left in Europe does. And so it's taking us longer. But I think the lesson is unmistakable. We have to have those organizations. If we can't rebuild those from the past, build new ones. Because that's the way you gather together the power that can begin to challenge and change a kind of economic evolution that threatens the majority of people.
Now, we're only a few months, just a month and a half really, or about a month into the Republican domination of both houses of Congress. Right away, they put in place a rule change to cut Social Security disability insurance in their literally first or second day in power. Could Republicans push Americans so far, even through inaction, in terms of just not allowing any of Obama's policies to go through, that people could say they've had enough?
Absolutely. And here's the irony of American history. You go back to the Great Depression, you see a progressive democratic push from below, and the irony is, having helped the people with unemployment compensation and Social Security and minimum wage, capitalism may very well have saved itself from the revolution that might otherwise have happened. And the irony now is that it'll be the conservatives who refuse to do that and thereby dig their own graves, politically speaking. And that would not be a surprise if you have a sense of the complex way that history works. And indeed, more and more Democrats are afraid that if you continue to push the mass of people this way, you will cross a line from which there will be no retreat, and that we will see the kinds of changes in this country that we used to imagine only happen someplace else.
President Obama has made many verbal moves that sound progressive on an economic front, but when push comes to shove, the things that he champions most are closing capital gains tax loopholes, which is nice. I mean, it nibbles in from the edges, but folks like John Nichols have said that had he pronounced himself as a bold visionary in terms of progressive economic policies, he could have made so much of a difference. He could have certainly shown himself to be a more popular president, and we see Hillary Clinton now attempting to capitalize on this populism, and it's sort of Democrats appear to be so weak on this. I mean, they don't know what they want, as opposed to the Republicans who are very clear on it, and they can't reconcile their own complicity in the current system.
Yes, but that's really what I was trying to say before. The wealthy in this society, the big corporations, the wealthy people, they long ago understood it is not safe to control American politics by just making one of the two parties dependent on you. You've got to make both of them. So the Democratic Party has become very dependent on the contributions of wealthy folks and big corporations, not as much as the Republican, but enough so that any elected Democrat has to be very careful before he or she says something which, while it might appeal to the mass of people suffering, would alienate the wealthy in the end upon whom they depend. So when President Obama says, like they all do, well, I can't do that, what you would like me to do, until you're organized, he's basically saying, I need those wealthy people, and unless and until you make it impossible for me to please them while fobbing you off with rhetoric, until that time, I'm going to fob you off with rhetoric. It's a proof again that there have to be much more fundamental changes for this situation to be ended. With President Obama, I would take it one step further. There's something ingenuous and dishonest in saying, I would respond if there was a mass movement, and then to be the president, as Obama was, who responded to a mass movement called Occupy Wall Street by bulldozing the tents from the public parks. He didn't help build Occupy Wall Street, he undid it. And so he bears some responsibility for the absence of the organization and the movement that he says he would have responded to had it been stronger.
Richard Wolff, I want to take a step back and ask you to tell our listeners a little bit about how you describe your own economic vision. Whenever we talk about you on our airwaves, we refer to you as a Marxian economist or a Marxist economist. What does that mean exactly? What is your vision for how a national or even international economic model could be designed?
Let me say a word about this description of Marxist economist. I welcome it. I'm not shying away from it. To tell you the truth, I'm proud of it, and let me tell you why. Economics as a discipline is about 300 years old. It is associated with names like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the great founders of the modern science of economics. And that's fine. They belong there. They did great work. Marx himself was very respectful of Smith and Ricardo. But Marx was different from them. They analyzed capitalism from the standpoint of somebody who loves it, who celebrates it. Marx came along and said, I want to understand the system, but I have a different perspective. I don't like it. I think the human race can do better. I'm a critic. And all I say to Americans is, if you want to understand a system, do you want only to speak to and listen to the people who love it, or do you also want to hear the arguments of those who criticize it? If you're not a lopsided intellectual, then you'd want it both. Right. My job, since the country is so lopsided the other way, is to try to correct the imbalance by providing a Marxist critique of capitalism and showing how we could do better. And that's why the word Marxist does neither frighten me nor push me away.
And so when we look at the way our economy is built from a grand scale, there are several things that we need to put at the heart of what we want. When I say we, I mean the 99% of Americans and ordinary people, and that is our own well-being, obviously. What other reason should there be for an economy to exist? And today, we have to include the health of the whole planet, because our fate is bound up in the health of the whole planet. The G20 is meeting currently in Istanbul, Turkey. The financial leaders around the world, presumably to tweak and craft and discuss amongst themselves the rules of global finance. They're not talking about things like climate change, about global income inequality, even though that might be the most appropriate place to discuss those things, right?
Yes, it's a very old problem, and you put your finger right on that key issue. An economic system is as good as the jobs and income and security and future it provides to people. We have it upside down in modern capitalism. We all adjust to the system. We should be adjusting the system to us. We're all worried what courses to take so we get a job. We're trying to find a place for us in the economic system. We ought to be just as interested in making the system serve us. And the reason the G20 and the others do what they do is that this is a system that is serving the people who sit at the top, and they let the chips fall where they may. For a while, it raised our standard of living in the 18th and 19th century, and even into the 20th. But that stopped now, and we now have a system that can't do what it once did. It is taking care of those at the top, and it is letting the rest of us in our jobs, our incomes. Look, this is the first generation of college students in this country that graduates with 50 grand of debt or more. Yeah. We're doing things to our children and to our society, as to the environment, that are not good for the majority of people. And capitalism as a system doesn't work if the majority of people are finding themselves shortchanged by the mechanisms. That's why a critical perspective seems to me more appropriate now than ever before.
Well, Dr. Richard Wolff, thank you for providing such a critical perspective, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
My guest, Dr. Richard Wolff, is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, currently visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York City. And you can check out his website at rdwolff.com. That's Wolf with 2 Fs. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Darren White is our research intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Federico Garcia, Kiana Turner, and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.